Hey guys, tonight we drift into the golden haze of ancient Greece, not the sword-clashing, monster-hunting part, but the part with complicated hairdos, competitive poetry, and gods who never learned boundaries. Specifically, we're entering the world of Apollo, the gleaming, golden boy of Mount Olympus, god of music, prophecy, healing, the sun, and possibly overcommitment. If the ancient Greeks had a celebrity calendar, he'd be Mr. July through December. You're lying on a woven mat in the soft shadow of a laurel tree. There's the distant chirp of cicadas and the smell of olive oil sunbathing on someone's shoulders. You can hear someone tuning a lyre with almost annoying confidence, and you just know it's him, Apollo, the divine show-off, born on a floating island, glowing like daylight itself, and already composing bangers before his first diaper change. You're not going to compete with this guy. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins, as many myths do, with Zeus being irresponsible. His affair with the Titaness Leto results in pregnancy twins. In fact, and a deeply awkward situation. Hera, Zeus's wife and perennial grudge holder, forbids Leto from giving birth anywhere on the solid earth. Seems harsh, even for a myth. Eventually, Leto finds the island of Delos, which is not technically land, it's a floating rock, loopholes the original form of divine diplomacy. There, under the swaying palms and with no epidural in sight, she gives birth to Artemis first. Baby Artemis immediately helps deliver her twin brother, Apollo. Yep, minutes old and already doing unpaid labor. Greek myths have zero chill. Apollo is glowing, literally. He radiates light. He doesn't cry. He just sort of hums in perfect pitch. A chorus of swans circles overhead, as if the world already knows this kid is going to rewrite the vibe of ancient civilization. From the start, Apollo's resume is suspiciously well-rounded. He's the god of the sun, sure, but also music, healing, archery, plague, awkward, and prophecy. He's like if a rock star, a motivational speaker, and a slightly unhinged life coach all merged into one being made of light. Your feet crunch along sun-warmed gravel as you follow Apollo's early years. He grows fast, as gods tend to do. One moment, he's a glowing toddler strumming harp strings made of sunbeams. The next, he's shooting arrows at a monstrous python just for blocking the vibe of his future temple. That's the Pythian python. By the way, Apollo kills it, claims the site of Delphi, and starts handing out riddles like fortune cookies on a power trip. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before all that prophecy nonsense, Apollo's musical career kicks off with a theft. Not by him, but by Hermes, his baby brother. We'll get there in the next section. For now, you recline under the imagined glow of ancient sunlight and let the golden boy's presence wash over you. The way people talked about Apollo. It was less like describing a god and more like name-dropping a celebrity you somehow ran into at brunch. Oh yeah, Apollo. We jammed once. He lit up the room. Literally. I'm still blind in one eye. Historians still argue whether Apollo's sweeping portfolio came from genuine worship or a bureaucratic attempt to combine multiple regional deities into one streamlined package. But in either case, he quickly became the Hellenic poster child for elegance, order, and what today might be called main character energy. One of the earliest quirks about Apollo isn't his music or his hair, or even the murder. It's his weird obsession with laurel leaves. After being rejected by Daphne, and we'll get to that uncomfortable episode soon, he declares the laurel tree sacred and insists all his future fan clubs wear wreaths made from it. It's the ancient version of rebranding your heartbreak into a fashion line. You walk through a sunlit colonnade, half asleep now. The marble cool beneath your steps. The air carries a subtle chord, a perfect C note. Sustained, like the atmosphere itself is tuning up. And maybe it is. In ancient Greek culture, Apollo's music wasn't just background noise, it was cosmic order. The idea was that the stars and planets made inaudible music, the music of the spheres, and Apollo was its conductor. According to this philosophy, everything from seasons to emotions to the fate of nations followed the invisible rhythm of his divine playlist. Oddly enough, one fringe belief suggested that if a mortal ever managed to hear the music of the spheres directly, their brain would implode from too much harmony. A rather intense Yelp review of the universe. But you're safe. You're just here to drift, to listen, to lie back under the shade of myth, and maybe, if the timing's right, let the sound of an ancient lyre pull you gently into sleep. You're dozing in a sun-dappled olive grove when a soft but mischievous giggle rustles through the leaves. It's not Apollo this time, it's Hermes, and he's a baby. Literally a baby. Like still in swaddling cloths baby, and yet somehow he's about to commit the first recorded act of musical larceny. Hermes is born in a cave, far from Mount Olympus, to Maia, a quiet, shadow-loving nymph. Unlike Apollo's flashy golden debut, Hermes' arrival is more subtle. But don't let that fool you. Before his first sunset, this infant god will crawl out of his crib, invent sandals, yes, really, and make off with a herd of Apollo's sacred cattle. You know, baby stuff. Now, Apollo shimmering, sun-pulling, musically overachieving. Apollo does not appreciate having his cattle stolen, not even a little bit, so he storms over to confront Maia. She gestures toward her newborn son who, by all appearances, is wrapped up peacefully and smelling faintly of goat milk. Apollo narrows his eyes. He knows better. What follows is one of the odder episodes in mythology. Apollo and baby Hermes are taken before Zeus for judgment. Hermes denies everything, burps, and then, in a stroke of pure charisma, offers Apollo a peace offering. It's a lyre. Now, here's the twist. Hermes invented the lyre just that morning. Using a tortoise shell, some reeds, and a few strands of cowgut from, those stolen cattle. Hermes crafted the world's first stringed instrument. It's small, curved like a crescent moon, and when he plucks it, the sound is oddly divine, soft, shimmering, not unlike the feeling of remembering a song you haven't heard since childhood. Apollo listens, and listens, and suddenly, all is forgiven. He falls in love with the sound instantly, and in a very undivine display of impulsiveness, trades all the cattle for the instrument. And just like that, the lyre becomes Apollo's symbol forever. Historians still argue whether this story represents a literal moment of cultural transition, perhaps the merging of older pastoral deities with rising musical cults, or maybe it's just an old Greek joke about musicians being easily bribed with gear. What's not debated is the lasting symbolism. The lyre becomes Apollo's emblem, appearing in statues, coins, frescoes, an ancient version of a signature guitar slung across a rock star's back. He never goes anywhere without it now. You watch as he cradles it, head tilted just slightly, fingers dancing over the strings. The sound isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It threads itself through the air like sunlight through gauze. You swear even the olive trees lean in. This isn't just music. It's persuasion, power, peace. The Greeks believed that Apollo's music could stop riots, cure madness, even sway the will of kings. That tiny tortoise-shell creation becomes the tool through which he communicates not just melodies, but messages of fate, healing, and sometimes veiled threats. One fun fringe belief. Some folks claim that the lyre, when played properly, could charm wild animals. There are a few scattered vase paintings of Apollo casually strumming while lions nap at his feet like house cats. You suspect there may have been some exaggeration there, or just ancient artists hoping for a good visual gag. But the more pressing issue is this: now that Apollo has the lyre, what's he going to do with it? Answer: everything. He doesn't just perform, he composes, he trains. He forms an entire ecosystem of mythic creatives around himself: muses, poets, musicians, dreamers. He becomes, in essence, the manager of a divine record label. And somewhere in the dusty corners of Greek villages, people begin telling stories, not just of Apollo the sun god or the plague slinger, but of Apollo the artist, the performer, the god who could melt your heart with a melody, or harden it with a song of war. You pass a sleepy amphora painting on your way out of the scene. Apollo is there, reclining, lyre in hand, serenading what looks like a deer in mild confusion. In the background, a tiny baby. Hermes peeks out from behind a column, looking unrepentantly smug. You smile. Because while Apollo may carry the lyre now, the origin story will always belong to Hermes the trickster, the infant inventor, the god who turned a tortoise into the first music contract. And now that Apollo has his instrument, there's no going back. The age of divine music has officially begun. You're already drifting, half asleep, when you feel the temperature rise just slightly, like someone turned up the sun by 1 notch. That's not the fan, that's Apollo. He's on duty now. Not content with being a music god, he also volunteers more or less to drive the sun across the sky every day. It's not clear whether this is a full-time job or just another item on his eternal side hustle list. But here he is, every morning, climbing into a golden chariot and lighting up the world like he's a mythological Uber driver with a radiant 5-star rating. You rub your eyes and squint at the horizon. The chariot isn't pulled by horses. It's pulled by fire-breathing steeds, with manes made of sunlight and hooves that spark against the clouds. Apollo reins them in like he's done this forever. You get the sense he likes making an entrance. But here's the thing: he's not always a graceful driver. There are myths suggesting Apollo occasionally overdoes it. The sun blazes a little too fiercely. Crops wilt. Mortals sweat through their chitons. Once, he lets his own son, Phaethon, take the reins. It does not go well. The boy loses control, scorches half the earth, and ultimately gets yeeted out of the chariot by Zeus's thunderbolt. Bit of a downer. So Apollo sticks to the role himself after that. Thank you very much. Still, he doesn't multitask like a mortal. He's not sipping iced coffee and checking emails. He's playing music. The chariot sways to the rhythm of his lyre, each note sending pulses of light across the sky. You can almost see the sound, sunbeams flickering in time. Golden notes painted on clouds. Birds follow him, not just because he brings dawn, but because they're genuinely into the vibe. Historians still argue whether this solar symbolism predates Apollo's association with the sun or came later, possibly influenced by Persian or Egyptian sun deities. He wasn't always a sun god, after all. Earlier versions of Apollo are more shadowy and moody, still poetic, still radiant, but not literally carrying daylight in his pockets. The music and healing stuff came first. The sun charioteering was added over time, like a musician taking up acting mid-career. One of the less discussed details: Apollo sings while driving. Not loudly, not like stadium rock, more like a hum that threads its way across the sky. It's said his dawn songs help flowers bloom. Farmers once claimed they could hear his voice in the rustle of barley fields. Maybe it's the wind, maybe not. There's even a quirky belief preserved in some Roman texts that if you wake just before dawn and listen closely, Apollo's melody can be heard in the space between birdsong and breeze, a kind of celestial warm-up act. You imagine what it's like cruising through the sky in a flaming chariot, cloak whipping in the solar wind, harp tucked under one arm, humming to yourself while the world slowly rotates beneath you. No pressure, just billions of mortals relying on you to not oversleep. And he rarely does. But Apollo's job isn't just solar. He's also watching, listening, taking mental notes like a divine talent scout. From up there, he hears music rising from valleys, temples, wine-soaked banquets, and lonely shepherds singing to their goats. Some of it impresses him, some not so much. And when someone plays badly, he notices. It's around this time that Apollo develops a reputation, not just as a performer, but as a critic, a harsh one. This is not a god who claps politely for everyone. He has opinions, and sometimes he expresses them with, well, arrows. Musical excellence isn't just a preference, it's a divine requirement. Bad music offends him. Improper tuning can invite divine consequences. It's a terrifying but very effective way to ensure artistic integrity. Still, it's hard to stay mad at him, because when he plays, it's impossible not to listen. You feel it now, a low string tremble that rolls over the landscape like a whisper of warmth. It's not loud. It doesn't have to be. Apollo's music doesn't fill your ears. It fills your bones. It reminds you that you're part of something big and rhythmic and golden. You lie back and feel the sun on your eyelids. He's up there now, somewhere. Not just lighting the world, but scoring it. You blink, and the sky dims just enough for the stars to flirt with visibility. Apollo has parked his chariot somewhere behind a mountain, the horses cooling down with celestial oats or whatever mythological horses eat. But Apollo isn't done, not even close, because down here, on the dusty, time-scented slopes of Mount Helicon, another project is underway. It's time to meet the Muses. There are 9 of them. Yes, 9, and they're not just backup dancers. These goddesses are each in charge of a different creative field: poetry, music, dance, astronomy, history, tragedy, comedy, epic, and hymns. You'd think Apollo could handle all that himself, but even ancient Greek gods understood the value of delegation. You're lounging near a spring as night deepens, and you can hear the faint giggling of the Muses as they rehearse verses, hum scales, and exchange withering critiques of Homer's early drafts. They're divine, but also just slightly intimidating, like a really opinionated book club with godlike powers. Apollo arrives, lyre in hand, barefoot and golden as usual. The Muses cluster around him, not like fans, but like co-workers meeting their eccentric boss. He smiles, nods at Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and strums a few notes that practically glow in the air. Instantly, the grove hushes. Even the cicadas stop to listen. This is how Apollo begins to assemble what might be the world's first creative agency. His partnership with the Muses is less about command and more about collaboration. Together, they become the engines of culture, divine producers of all the stories, songs, and dances that trickle down into mortal minds. Historians still argue whether the cult of the Muses predates Apollo's influence or whether he was later inserted as their manager figure to give mythic structure to artistic inspiration. Either way, this divine team-up helps formalize the ancient Greek concept of creativity as something external, something you receive, not invent. You don't write a poem. You channel one. You don't compose music. You listen closely enough, and the Muses whisper it to you. That belief lives on. By the way, every time someone says they're waiting for inspiration, they're basically invoking the Muses. You glance at the cast list again. There's Clio with her scrolls of history, Erato, fluttering with romantic lyrics, Melpomene, the tragic one, sighing dramatically into her wine. Urania points at the stars, while Terpsichore twirls gracefully in circles that make you dizzy just watching. Apollo knows them all, works with them all, and somehow maintains his spotlight in the middle of this talented whirlwind. Because he's not just performing, he's curating. He's turning Mount Helicon into the original Spotify playlist, a blend of moods, modes, and mythic genres, all arranged to keep human civilization just inspired enough not to destroy itself. One fringe belief that occasionally pops up in lesser-known texts: the muses are also low-key pranksters. They sometimes whisper completely useless ideas into the ears of arrogant poets just to mess with them. Bad sonnets blame Euterpe having a laugh. That bizarre dream you had about turtles in togas, probably Thalia doing a bit. And Apollo. He plays along. He likes perfection. Yes, but he also understands that art sometimes needs a little chaos. Not too much. He's still Apollo, but enough to keep things interesting. You drift now, listening to their music seep into the ground, into the roots of the trees, into your breath. There's a reason the Greeks built temples on hills and mountains. Up here, the air is thinner. The mind wanders. You're more likely to feel that invisible thread tugging at your thoughts, urging you to write something, sing something, feel something. It's not a coincidence. It's design. You turn your head slightly and catch Apollo sketching musical notation into the dirt with a stick. A melody, maybe, or a riddle. The lines blur in the moonlight. Around him, the muses continue their divine rehearsal, a harmonic storm of verse and rhythm and memory. This is how the music industry begins. Not with profit, not with fame, but with a barefoot god and 9 sisters spinning art out of silence. The grass is warm beneath you as dawn tiptoes back across the sky, and in the stillness of early morning, you catch the sound of something peculiar, a low, reedy whistle, somewhere between a sigh and a yawn. It's not Apollo this time. It's someone else entirely, someone with goat legs, a wild beard, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never owning a mirror. Pan? Yes, Pan, the god of shepherds, flocks, and chaotic forest energy. He's playing his signature instrument, the panpipes, or syrinx, named after a nymph who, like most females in Greek mythology, wanted nothing to do with her pursuer and transformed into an inanimate object to avoid him. In this case, reeds. Pan, undeterred, bundles those reeds together and makes a flute. The result, a haunting, breathy tune that sounds like a lonely breeze through a half-forgotten glade. Charming, in a scruffy sort of way. Now, Pan has something to prove. He thinks his pipes are better than Apollo's lyre. And so begins what may be the ancient world's first battle of the bands. You find yourself transported to the foot of Mount Tumulus, where a curious crowd has gathered dryads peeking from behind trees, satyrs lounging like bored roadies, a few nymphs passing around wine. Everyone's here to watch the showdown. Mount Tumulus, the mountain itself, agrees to be the judge, because in ancient myths, even geography gets a vote. Pan goes first. He puffs out his chest, raises his pipes, and lets loose a jaunty tune. It's rough around the edges, but lively like something you'd hear at a particularly cheerful goat festival. The forest sways, birds chirp in time. A few satyrs start clapping offbeat, because rhythm is not their strong suit. Then it's Apollo's turn. He steps forward, lyre in hand, all sunlit composure and infuriating confidence. He plucks one note. Just one. And the entire mountain seems to exhale. Then another. And another. Soon, the world is leaning in. Leaves tremble. Clouds pause. You're not even sure you're breathing anymore. By the time Apollo finishes, it's not even a contest. Mount Tumulus declares him the winner immediately. The crowd nods in solemn agreement, except for one guy. Midas. Yes, that Midas. The one with the golden touch and no known history of good decisions. He insists Pan's music was better. Apollo, ever the gracious winner, reacts in a totally measured and mature way. He turns Midas's ears into donkey ears. Fringe scholars love this bit not just for the comedy, but for what it might say about musical elitism in ancient Greece. Was Apollo too harsh? Was Midas simply ahead of his time? Like someone insisting the kazoo deserves more respect. Historians still argue whether this myth was commentary on aesthetics, class, or just the ancient equivalent of a roast battle gone too far. You, meanwhile, are left to consider the bigger picture. This was no small contest. This was the moment when Apollo's music moved from divine elegance to public spectacle. It wasn't just about perfection anymore. It was about comparison, about performance, about being seen. You open one eye as the crowd disperses. Midas slinks away, clutching his donkey ears. Pan shrugs and wanders off into the woods, already forgetting the whole thing. And Apollo, he just sits quietly, tuning his lyre, like none of it mattered. But it did? Because this wasn't just a myth, it was a format, a formula, music, judged by audience reaction, dramatized for effect, ending with humiliation or triumph. If that sounds familiar, it should. This is basically the first televised talent show, minus the cameras. You imagine it now, mythical idol, with Mount Tmolus as Simon Cowell and Pan as the scruffy underdog contestant. Apollo, of course, is the golden-voiced favorite who never hits a wrong note. You smile? Because even in ancient Greece, people couldn't resist a little drama with their music. You wake to the sound of water dripping rhythmically from a cave ceiling, somewhere deep in the mythological wilderness. The air smells like damp stone and pine sap. There's a flute echoing through the trees, but it's not playful this time. It's desperate, off-key, just a little frantic. This is not another musical duel. This is a tragedy, the kind that starts with bravado and ends with someone getting flayed alive. Meet Marsyas, a satyr, half man, half goat, all misjudgment. You see him now hair wild, eyes gleaming with the fevered confidence of someone who just discovered a new sound and thinks he invented genius. He found a flute lying in the reeds one day, the kind you blow across, and from the first note, he was obsessed. He played it night and day. He taught himself melodies, invented little riffs, and eventually, like many musicians with just enough talent and way too much ego, he thought, I could beat Apollo at this. Spoiler, he could not. But Marsyas didn't know that, or didn't care, maybe both. So he issues the challenge, publicly, loudly, and Apollo, whose golden feathers get ruffled very easily, accepts. They meet in the forest clearing at dawn. Marsyas goes first. He plays well, really well. He's not just tooting into a stick. There's rhythm, energy, even a kind of raw emotion. The animals gather. The wind quiets. A few trees seem moved. Then Apollo raises his lyre. What comes out is unfair. It's silk and starlight and every lullaby you've ever forgotten. It doesn't just sound better, it feels better, like someone combing your thoughts into neat, peaceful rows. Still, Marsyas keeps up, sort of, until Apollo raises the stakes. He turns the duel into a duet, demanding that both players sing and play at the same time. With a lyre, that's easy. With a flute, impossible. You can't blow and speak at once, not even for a satyr. And that, right there, is the trap. Apollo wins by technicality, not by skill, not by inspiration, but by sheer clever cruelty. The punishment? Gruesome. You don't see it directly, thankfully, but myth says Apollo flays Marsyas alive and nails his skin to a tree as a warning. That escalated quickly. You shiver. Even the cicadas are quiet now. Historians still argue whether this tale reflects a cultural clash, Apollo representing order and high art, Marsyas, representing wild folk creativity. The myth may be a symbolic purge of rustic traditions by more polished urban aesthetics. Or it may just be a particularly savage cautionary tale about knowing your limits. Still, fringe versions of the story suggest Apollo later regrets his brutality. Some versions even say he weeps, and his tears form a river appropriately named the Marsyas. A watery apology, centuries too late. You follow the trickle of that mythical river now. It winds through a grove where nothing sings. Even the birds seem to avoid the spot. But don't let the horror linger too long. This is mythology, not a courtroom transcript. And Greek myths love contrast. For every cruelty, there's a kindness. For every brutal end, a poetic echo. In the case of Marsyas, his story survives in stone carvings, in whispered warnings, and in the quiet hum of anyone who ever thought their solo was better than it actually was. You lie back again, letting Apollo's lyre lull you once more, not because he deserved to win, but because even gods can be flawed. And sometimes, the music industry gets ugly. You shift slightly, and now the sun's not so bright. It's lower in the sky, washed in amber, and just a little bit lonely. There's a breeze through the cypress trees, and it smells like longing. Because tonight, we follow Apollo not in his glory, but in his heartbreak. And her name is Daphne. She's a nymph young, wild, fiercely independent. Her hair is a mess in the best way. She runs faster than most men, fights better than some minor gods, and wants absolutely nothing to do with love, especially not Apollo's. But love doesn't always ask permission. It starts with a prank, because of course it does. Eros, yes. That Eros, the tiny chaos goblin with the bow, gets annoyed at Apollo for talking trash about his archery skills. Big mistake. Eros fires 2 arrows, one golden, filled with uncontrollable desire, and another lead-tipped, stuffed with repulsion. He shoots Apollo with the love arrow, and Daphne with the nope arrow. And just like that, it's a cosmic disaster. You watch from a shaded hillside as Apollo falls head over lyre. It's immediate. He doesn't just like Daphne. He wants her with poetry, with music, with the kind of infatuation that inspires both art and restraining orders. He follows her through the forest, calling out, trying every trick in the divine flirting handbook. Daphne, meanwhile, is not having it top. She runs fast, through streams, over rocks, across flower-filled meadows. Apollo follows, not malicious, just tragically enthusiastic. He keeps trying to explain himself through compliments, odes, increasingly desperate pleas. But Daphne only runs harder, until she reaches a river, and calls out to her father Peneus, the river god, for help. He answers. Instantly, roots grow from her feet, her skin hardens to bark, her hair becomes a canopy of leaves, her arms stretch skyward, and in moments, Daphne is no longer a girl. She's a laurel tree. You stand there with Apollo, blinking. He reaches out, but her bark is smooth and cool and completely indifferent. The chase is over. She's gone, and yet, still there. Apollo doesn't rage. He doesn't punish. He just steps forward, presses his forehead to the tree, and whispers something soft. Then he breaks off a branch not to harm her, but to honor her. He declares the laurel sacred. Wreaths of it will crown poets, priests, and victors. Her name will be spoken in songs. Her leaves will never wither. Historians still argue whether Daphne's story was a metaphor for the rejection of base desire in favor of eternal glory, or a warning about what happens when even gods refuse to hear no. There are layers to it, and none of them are simple. But here's the quieter truth. This is the first time Apollo's music doesn't fix everything. His charm, his art, his endless golden glow, none of it can change her mind. And so he does something rare for a Greek god. He accepts it, sort of, and immortalizes her in the only way he knows how, by turning her into art. You drift beneath a laurel now, the same kind perhaps. The leaves rustle above you with a sigh that could almost be a song. Apollo plays something soft on his lyre, a tune that rises, then pauses, then rises again, but never quite resolves. It's a melody of missed chances? Of a love that became legend by never happening at all. The light shifts again, not quite night, not quite day. That hour where shadows are long and silence feels meaningful. You're standing now on the stone steps of a grand sanctuary, carved into the side of a sacred mountain. The scent of burning laurel hangs in the air. People speak in hushed tones. Somewhere deep inside, a voice murmurs riddles that no one can fully understand. You've arrived at Delphi. This is Apollo's real masterpiece, not the lyre, not the chariot, not even the muses. This is infrastructure. Welcome to the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, home of the Oracle, and possibly the most elaborate, chaotic, and mysterious press center in history. You glance around and see travelers from all over the ancient world. Kings, warriors, philosophers, anxious merchants lined up like it's opening day at the world's most cryptic advice booth. Inside the temple, there's a deep cavern, a tripod, a burning brazier, and at its heart, the Pythia. She's not a goddess. She's mortal, always a woman, always local, and always chosen for reasons that even the priests sort of hand-wave away. She sits above a fissure in the rock where sweet-smelling vapors rise, possibly ethylene gas. According to modern theories, whatever the substance, it seems to put her in a trance-like state where she channels the voice of Apollo. You peek inside. She's rocking slightly, eyes glazed, and her words come in bursts half poem, half nightmare. The priests nearby listen, nod, and translate her riddles into slightly more coherent riddles. These are then handed to the client, who will misinterpret them anyway. Apollo, watching from somewhere unseen, probably finds this hilarious. The oracle speaks for him, yes, but it's never straightforward. Ask if you'll win a war, and you'll hear a great empire will fall. Helpful, until you realize it was your empire. Ask about love, and she might answer with a metaphor involving olives and goats. Romantic, in its own confusing way. Historians still argue whether the oracle was a genuine conduit of divine will or a highly politicized institution cloaked in mystery and marketing. There's some evidence the priests were skilled in gathering intel from visitors and weaving it back into the prophecies. Essentially, ancient data mining. Still, the impact was enormous. The oracle at Delphi influenced battles, treaties, colonization, and even which crops to plant. Apollo wasn't just god of music anymore, he was also god of PR. And this was his flagship location. The Delphic temple complex becomes a hub not just religious, but cultural. Musicians come to perform. Poets read verses. Sculptors leave offerings. It's like Burning Man, if it were sponsored by a divine being obsessed with laurel wreaths and predictive riddles. You stroll past columns and worn mosaic tiles. Somewhere, someone is playing a flute. Someone else is crying softly. Pilgrims kneel before a statue of Apollo that looks suspiciously like it's checking its own reflection. But behind the pageantry is something real, something enduring. Because for all the confusion, all the vagueness, people came here hoping for answers, and the answers they got filtered through song, smoke, and sacred suggestion shaped lives. One fringe theory. Some believe Apollo didn't just speak through the Pythia. They suggest the very sound of Delphi was engineered, that the echo of voices in the chamber, the rhythmic chant of priests, the music drifting through marble halls, it all worked together to lull seekers into a heightened, dreamlike state. Music, again. But not to entertain, to prepare the soul. You step outside the temple and look out over the cliffs. The view is absurd. Steep hills falling into lush valleys, distant mountains softened by haze. You get it now. This wasn't just a shrine, it was a theater, a stage for prophecy. And every visit was a performance, starring Apollo as the unseen narrator. The oracle doesn't tell you what to do. She tells you what you already fear might happen. And that sticks. You stay a little longer at Delphi, half curious, half hypnotized. The temple hums with that special kind of energy, the ancient, crackling buzz of people who've come looking for truth and are leaving with riddles instead. And now, here comes the fun part, watching the mortals try to interpret what Apollo meant. You sit down on a warm stone ledge beside a merchant from Athens, clutching a scrap of papyrus and looking deeply confused. He just asked the oracle if his trading voyage will be successful. The answer: the sea brings gifts to those who sail without fear. But beware the laughter of the west wind. He nods solemnly, thanks the priests, and then proceeds to panic for the rest of his life about any breeze coming from his left. This is what happens when your god speaks in poetry. Ambiguity is the point. You drift among the crowd, and it's all the same men and women squinting at double meanings, consulting local sages, bribing priests for a clarified version, or just wildly guessing and charging into their destinies like it's a game of divine mad libs. A king hears he'll crush his enemies like grapes, only to realize it's his army that gets stomped. A woman asks about marriage and gets a line about joining water and fire in sacred balance, which probably means no, but she goes through with it anyway. It doesn't end well. Spoiler, he's allergic to both compromise and actual bathwater. Still, they keep coming. Because somehow, people trust the music behind the message, the tone, the delivery, the mystery. They believe that if Apollo says something even sideways, it must mean something important. Historians still argue whether these misinterpretations were due to genuine spiritual confusion, clever political strategy, or simply human optimism dressed in togas. The oracle gave you a melody. You had to decide the lyrics yourself. And here's the delightful twist: Apollo knew this. You remember how he loves performance, right? The oracle isn't just a priestess on a tripod. She's the main act in his greatest concert. You didn't come to get clarity, you came to experience divine ambiguity. And maybe, just maybe, to leave with the perfect excuse. I'm not invading your kingdom because I want to. Apollo told me to. Fringe mythologists even claim the oracle's responses were sometimes influenced by who asked the question. That same gift from the sea line. To a poet, it's about inspiration. To a sailor, it's about cargo. To a thief, it's probably a very poetic warning about drowning. You lean back as another group files past, debating their prophecy like it's a crossword puzzle with high-stakes consequences. They quote Apollo's words with solemnity, conviction, and often complete inaccuracy. One man insists the oracle told him to marry a goat. She absolutely did not. And yet, the goat is present. You try not to judge. Meanwhile, Apollo watches from somewhere above or within the sanctuary, quietly pleased. His riddles have legs. His words echo for decades, even centuries. Nobody remembers the oracle who said them, but the voice that belonged to him. And perhaps that's what he wanted all along. Not to be understood, but to be remembered. The sky is shifting again, brighter now, but not harsh, the kind of daydream light that makes everything look just a little unreal. You wander through an olive grove where poets used to sit and argue about meter and metaphors. And you realize Apollo's influence wasn't limited to temples and prophecies. He was a god of words too. You're stepping into the world of poetry now, and not just random verses scratched onto pottery. We're talking full-scale, bard level, myth-heavy, deeply rhythmic epics, odes that go on for hours, rhetoric that could hypnotize a crowd or bore them into a coma, depending on the speaker. Apollo wasn't just a muse for musicians, he was the patron of poetry slams before they were cool. You see it in the festivals like the Pythian Games, where people competed not only in athletic contests, but also in music and verse. Imagine the Olympics, but every javelin throw is followed by someone dramatically reciting a poem about the tragedy of hubris. Very on brand. And then there were the poets themselves, those scruffy, sunburned men in sandals who wandered from city to city, reciting tales of gods, heroes, and heartbreak. Many of them claimed divine inspiration, specifically from Apollo. You hear one now? He's sitting cross-legged under a fig tree, reciting lines about Achilles and Hector. His voice soft and sing-song. His lyre rests beside him like a sleeping cat. Every few lines, he pauses not for dramatic effect, but because he's waiting for the words to come to him, or from him. It's never clear. Was it the poet who spoke? Or Apollo, whispering through the cracks in human language? Historians still argue whether early Greek poets saw themselves as literal vessels for divine speech, or simply liked the prestige of claiming a god as their editor. But in Apollo's case, the association stuck. His name is woven into the roots of the Western literary tradition. Even Plato couldn't help but weigh in. He loved the idea of divine madness, the belief that real poets are driven by a kind of sacred frenzy, a beautiful loss of control. And guess who he credited with that madness? Apollo, of course. One fringe theory. Some ancient philosophers thought Apollo's poetic gift wasn't just spiritual, it was chemical. That the vibrations from his lyre altered brainwaves, calmed the nervous system, triggered some kind of pre-scientific alpha state where words flowed more easily. Basically, Apollo was the god of flow state. You drift further, now among stacks of scrolls, places where scribes tried to trap divine speech in ink. But poetry was never meant to sit still. It was supposed to live in the air, on the tongue, in the breath of the performer. That's why Apollo's poetry isn't static. It's fluid, melodic, musical even when silent. You remember Orpheus? He'll show up properly later, but even his earliest myths say he learned music and poetry from Apollo. One hand strummed strings, the other shaped verse. In this tradition, there's no hard line between a song and a poem. If it stirs your soul, it counts. And if it rhymes bonus points? You pause beside a mosaic showing Apollo with a quill behind one ear, anachronistic but charming, surrounded by scrolls. He's smiling just a little smug, as if he's already read all your poems and corrected your metaphors. You let yourself imagine him as an ancient editor, lounging with a cup of honeyed wine, scribbling cliché in the margins of Homer's first draft. But even Apollo had favorites. It's said he chose certain poets as his spokespeople, those rare mortals who got it just right, whose rhythm, tone, and message hit that divine trifecta of beauty, truth, and just enough mystery to keep people arguing for centuries. You lie back in the grass now, and words swirl through your mind like dandelion seeds. Not because you're trying, but because Apollo might be whispering. You're lying on a sun-warmed stone near the edge of a lazy stream, and somewhere nearby, someone's playing the lyre again. But this time, it's not for glory, it's not for prophecy or poetry or even a crowd. It's just for peace. Welcome to Apollo's lesser-known but much-loved superpower soothing people out of their misery with music. Yes, the god who once flayed a satyr alive also had a soft side. Music, under Apollo's hands, wasn't just a show, it was therapy. You shift slightly and feel the sun on your skin. Warm, but not too hot. the way it feels when you're half napping on a couch. That's the feeling ancient Greeks believed Apollo could create with just a few notes. He didn't need words. The music alone could calm minds, slow heartbeats, even help you forget that your sandals gave you blisters, or that your army just got wiped out by angry Spartans. There's a story not very famous, but quietly enduring of how Apollo once cured an entire village's hangover after a festival by playing his lyre at sunrise. No one remembers the exact tune, but the people woke slowly, smiling, feeling oddly reborn. One poet called it a melody that tasted like clean water. Another swore it cleared his head faster than any herbal concoction. Fringe believers even claim Apollo's music had actual physical effects, that it could speed healing, restore memory, maybe even realign the spine. There were cults that played lyre music to the sick, not just for morale, but as an act of divine medicine. Historians still argue whether this was sincere belief or early placebo. But let's be honest, sometimes music does heal. Anyone who's ever cried to a sad playlist or felt their shoulders loosen during a soft instrumental track gets it. And Apollo understood that. You picture him now, sitting alone on a quiet hillside after a long day of prophecy and fire chariot duty. The world is asleep, the stars hum above, and he plays not grand symphonies, not dazzling solos, but small, slow songs that never need to be remembered, only felt. That's the thing. Apollo's music wasn't always about impressing people. Sometimes it was about undoing them, loosening the knots of grief, smoothing the wrinkles of anxiety. He was the sound of deep exhale, of that moment after tears, when silence feels like kindness. Even in war, soldiers claim to hear his music on the wind just before battle. Not rousing, not adrenaline pumping, but steadying, like someone putting a hand on your shoulder and saying, "You're still here. Breathe." One minor myth tells of a woman who lost her son in battle. She wandered the hills of Delphi, mad with grief. People avoided her. She screamed at the sky, but Apollo found her, sat beside her, played, not to cheer her up, but to keep her from vanishing completely inside the sorrow. By the time the sun rose, she was quiet again. Not cured, but returned. Apollo's music had that power, not to erase pain, but to hold it, to wrap it in gold and rhythm until it felt like something that could be survived. You let your eyes close. The stream murmurs beside you. Somewhere, a lyre note rises, holds, and fades. You imagine the god himself not shining and perfect, but quiet, almost invisible. Somewhere just beyond sight, tuning strings you didn't know you had. And when the next note plays, your breath slows, your jaw unclenches, you forget what you were worried about. Because sometimes Apollo doesn't speak. He just plays. The afternoon breeze shifts, and you catch something in the air, not a melody this time, but a memory of one, a feeling. The kind of tune that gets stuck in your head, not because it's catchy, but because it makes everything feel like it matters just a little bit more. That's what Apollo's music did. It didn't just entertain, it altered moods, minds, even reality, if you believed hard enough. Music, in his divine hands, wasn't decoration. It was a tool, a force, a subtle form of control. You walk now through a temple courtyard where no one's speaking. They're all listening. A single lyre plays from somewhere out of sight, soft, slow, deliberate. The kind of song that could make you forgive an enemy or confess to eating the last olive. People aren't dancing. They're thinking, feeling things they didn't mean to. That was Apollo's other gift, music as mood control. It's said he could quiet a riot with a chord, or stir one with the same, if he played it just slightly off. Entire cities listened for his influence subtle, tonal nudges from somewhere just above the clouds. And it wasn't always peaceful. Remember, Apollo is also the god of plague. Yep, same guy. Sometimes he sent disease with music, like a bad remix gone viral, literally. In one myth, when the Greeks slighted him during the Trojan War, Apollo didn't throw a fit. He just stood on a distant hill, pulled out his bow or possibly his lyre, depending on the version, and sent arrows or notes of illness into the enemy camp. A performance with consequences. Some fringe interpretations say that these arrows were metaphors for sound ultrasonic waves, dissonant frequencies, emotional vibrations that unraveled people from the inside, ancient acoustics with a body count. Historians still argue whether this duality healing and harming was meant to illustrate balance or simply the terrifying range of divine power. Either way, Apollo wasn't just the god of nice songs, he was the god of effect. Music wasn't passive. It acted. It did something. And everyone knew it. In fact, every major event in ancient life had music behind it. Weddings, funerals, sacrifices, victories, not just background tunes, but pieces meant to steer the emotional current of the room. And almost always, they were in the style of Apollo. Even when they weren't invoking his name, they were copying his model. A little structure, a little shimmer, a little mystery. You pass a gathering now, young men in training, learning to fight. But before the sparring begins, a flute plays, not a war song, a calming one, designed to steady their breathing, align their movements, clear their minds. Apollo again. One ancient source even claims certain rhythms were outlawed because they stirred disorder in the blood. In other words, the wrong song could start a rebellion. And so the state got involved. Music became politics. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle had strong opinions. Plato warned that if you let the wrong musical modes run wild dissonant scales, unruly rhythms, society itself could unravel. So much for harmless entertainment. Apollo, naturally, was upheld as the ideal. His music represented order, harmony, the noble soul, the approved soundtrack to civilization. Which is funny, considering his own mythology was anything but calm. Prophecies, affairs, vengeance, duel after duel, and yet, his music was always the one considered safe. You glance up at a fresco showing him strumming his lyre while the world burns gently in the background. He looks serene, polished, unbothered. A vibe curator in a collapsing empire? And maybe that's why his music worked. It didn't deny chaos. It framed it, wrapped it in rhythm, made it feel survivable. Now you hear it too. Not the music itself, but the echo of it in the rustling trees, in your own heartbeat, in the way your thoughts move slower now. That's Apollo's final trick. Not a song you hear, but one you feel. The air has shifted again, heavier now, more thoughtful. You find yourself beneath the colonnade of a quiet academy, the marble smooth beneath your hands, the scent of scrolls and old arguments lingering in the shade. The lyre is silent here, but Apollo's music is still playing inside minds now, bouncing between ideas. You've entered the realm of philosophers, and they have opinions. You sit near a cluster of young students, tunics dusted with chalk, eyes sharp with thought. They're arguing not with fists or weapons, but with metaphors and half-remembered quotes. In the center, a bearded man paces slowly. He's not angry, just invested. He wants to know whether Apollo's music is uplifting or dangerously seductive. Spoiler, there is no right answer. Let's start with Plato. You remember him, the ultimate idealist. Everything categorized in neat little forms. He loved the idea of Apollo. Order, harmony, clean lines. He thought music had the power to shape the soul. The right kind made you virtuous, the wrong kind chaos. So naturally, he recommended banning certain scales. Yes, You heard that right. Actual musical censorship. Plato wanted to eliminate modes that made people too emotional, too aggressive, or worst of all, too soft. Music, to him, wasn't a neutral art. It was moral technology, and Apollo. He was the ideal composer, precise, rational, properly divine. But then there's Aristotle. He's more chill about it. He agreed that music influenced behavior, but thought it was okay to indulge a little. Catharsis, he said. Let people cry at the tragedy. Let them dance at the party. Just don't live in it. He believed Apollo's music could train you to manage your emotions like emotional yoga, with a soundtrack. Not suppression, not indulgence, just good, controlled, balanced expression. Historians still argue whether these thinkers genuinely believed in the spiritual power of music, or were just using Apollo as a metaphor for intellectual control. Either way, music moved from being purely divine to something that could be studied, critiqued, and yes, graded. Which brings us to one particularly entertaining fringe tidbit, a set of ancient musical treatises that attempted to mathematically rank instruments by virtue. Lyre top marks, harp acceptable, panpipes suspiciously rural, drums absolutely scandalous. The less Apollonian it sounded, the more suspect it became. And so Apollo's brand, over time, became associated not just with melody, but with refinement. He was no longer just a god of art. He was the god of approved art. You glance at a painted tile on the wall. It shows Apollo in a tunic, just a little too perfect, reclining on a polished stool, surrounded by scrolls. A few students gaze up at him. One is falling asleep. Another's clearly pretending to understand modal theory. And yet, the god smiles. Because even when they argued, they talked about him. His name, his sound, his influence, it all stayed alive in their questions, their anxieties, their hopes that somewhere out there was a kind of music that could make the world make sense. You shift your weight. The marble creaks softly beneath you. The lyre still doesn't play, but you feel it. Not in your ears. In your thinking? Apollo's music is here too. Just in a different key. The wind picks up again, not harsh, but playful. You smell wildflowers, hear distant birdsong, and for a moment, you're not in a temple or an academy. You're on a gentle slope near Mount Helicon, and there's laughter nearby. Real, full-bellied laughter. Someone just told a joke about Zeus, and no one got smited. A rare moment. Here come the boy bands. Not literal, of course, but you're about to meet Apollo's most famous protégés, mortal musicians, who carried his divine spark. The heartbreakers of the ancient world. Artists with tragic destinies and killer stage presence. First up, Orpheus. You've heard of him, maybe too much. The man who played music so beautiful. It made trees sway and rivers stop midstream. Who descended into the underworld just to get his wife back. Who charmed Hades and Persephone with a single song and then blew it all by looking back too soon. Classic. But here's the part they skip. Orpheus learned from Apollo. You imagine the scene, the young bard sitting at the god's feet, wide-eyed, fingers fumbling on the lyre as Apollo leans over, adjusting the strings, a teacher and his favorite student. And for a while, it works. Orpheus becomes the standard, the mortal benchmark. When people say, he plays like Orpheus, they really mean, he almost sounds divine. Next, Linus. Not the blanket guy. This one was a legendary musician, composer, and possibly a tragic footnote. He taught music to Heracles, yes, the strongman himself, and was apparently so strict that Heracles killed him in a fit of rage. Talk about a bad recital, but Linus was no hack. Some even say he invented entire musical styles later used by the classical Greeks. His songs, sadly, did not survive. Probably too good for this world. Then there's Hyacinthus. Young, radiant, athletic, and yes, tragically beautiful. Apollo fell for him hard. They practiced discus throws together. They wrote poetry in the grass. It was soft, pastoral, like the start of a romance novel set in the Peloponnese. Then came the accident. Hyacinthus was struck in the head by a discus. Whether it was a tragic misthrow or the result of divine jealousy from the wind god Zephyrus, who also fancied him, is still up for debate. Either way, Hyacinthus dies, Apollo mourns, and where his blood spills, hyacinth flowers bloom. Apollo turns heartbreak into art once again. Historians still argue whether these myths reflect real music, traditions passed through oral culture, or if they were entirely invented to give noble origins to the practice of music. But either way, they show one thing clearly: Apollo wasn't just a performer. He was a mentor. A star maker? And like all great mentors, he had favorites. Mortal artists he elevated, taught, and mourned when the world proved too rough for their delicate strings. You lie on the grass now, watching the clouds drift lazily above Mount Helicon. You hear faint chords, different ones, from different musicians. You picture Orpheus rehearsing softly by moonlight, Linus writing meticulous notes, Hyacinthus laughing in the sun. Fringe believers used to say that if you slept on this mountain during midsummer, you could hear their songs in your dreams, that Apollo sometimes still plays duets with ghosts. You close your eyes and listen. You can almost believe it. The sun's dipped a little lower now, and the air feels heavier, thicker, quieter. You're standing at the mouth of a cave, and something inside is humming. Not the friendly kind of hum. This one's deeper, older, like the earth itself has a secret stuck in its throat. Welcome to the underworld. Don't panic, it's just a visit. You're following Orpheus now, the greatest of Apollo's mortal musicians, as he takes his most famous and most ill-advised gig, yet a solo performance for the dead. You remember Eurydice, right? His wife, his muse, his everything. Bitten by a snake on their wedding day, classic tragedy setup. She dies, he breaks, and when Orpheus breaks, he doesn't cry. He sings, the saddest, most gut-wrenching song ever played on a lyre. And it works. It moves people, animals, trees, gods, even Hades. The Lord of the Dead actually grants Orpheus a one-time backstage pass to retrieve Eurydice on one condition: he must not look back until they've both reached the world above. And of course, he does. But let's slow down a bit. Because what's fascinating isn't just the journey, it's who taught him to play the way he did. Apollo. This is where you start to see how far Apollo's influence reaches. His music isn't just about beauty or order or light, it's about crossing boundaries, between joy and sorrow, between gods and mortals, even between life and death. Orpheus plays, and Cerberus' three-headed nightmare dog lies down like a sleepy puppy. The Furies weep quietly into their claws. Sisyphus takes a break from pushing his rock. The whole place just pauses. That's how powerful this music is. Fringe theorists believe that Apollo's training gave Orpheus access to secret chords, sonic spells that resonated on a frequency the underworld couldn't resist. They call it the lyric pathway, a vibrational bridge between worlds. It's not in any official scroll, but the idea lives on in whispered fragments of songs sung by night fishermen and wandering minstrels. You follow Orpheus through those dim corridors, listening to the ghostly echoes of his notes bouncing off damp stone. Eurydice walks silently behind him, so close, yet so far. He looks back. She fades. The music stops. And when Orpheus returns alone to the surface, he plays no more. That's the real end of the story, not the tragic glance, but the silence afterward. Apollo gave him everything a voice that could crack the sky, but even he couldn't save Orpheus from himself. Still, the tale doesn't vanish, it evolves. Later poets claim Orpheus kept singing, but only to animals, or only at night, or only in his head. Others say Apollo took pity on him and lifted his soul to the stars. One version even suggests Orpheus's lyre was placed in the heavens as a constellation. You look up, it's there. Lyra, the ghost of a song that once charmed the dead. Historians still argue whether this myth was a cautionary tale about grief or an ancient metaphor for the limits of artistic power. You can move hearts, change minds, even calm monsters, but you can't undo fate. And Apollo, he never speaks about it. But some say his own music grew softer after that, more mournful, less eager to dazzle. Because even the god of song can't always write a happy ending. You sit on a stone, surrounded by quiet. No instruments, no applause, just the knowledge that once a mortal tried to bring someone back with nothing but a melody, and almost did. Almost? The wind shifts again, less like a breeze, more like a Roman banner catching air. You blink, and the world's been redrawn. No more soft Greek columns or groves of laurel trees. Now it's marble arches, paved roads, red-draped senators, and a strong smell of olive oil and ambition. Apollo has gone Roman, and it's a rebrand. You're in the heart of the empire now, Rome, where gods get remodeled like outdated villas. The Roman Apollo still carries a lyre, yes, but now he's sleeker, sharper, a little more imperial. His curly hair is better styled, his robes more dramatic. The golden glow is dialed up, the poetry trimmed down, and everything about him says, I've been endorsed by the state. Because he has. You pass a statue, Apollo, standing like a military general and a runway model all at once, one hand holding his lyre like a badge of authority. This isn't just the god of art anymore. This is the god of propaganda. It starts with Augustus, Rome's first emperor, brilliant strategist, subtle tyrant, and PR master. He adopts Apollo as his personal divine sponsor, plastering his image all over coins, temples, poems, and political speeches. You see, Augustus wants Rome to be associated with peace, order, and cultural refinement. And Apollo, he checks all those boxes with abs. Even the Battle of Actium, where Augustus defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra, is later spun into a kind of celestial collaboration Apollo helped. Not with weapons, he's not that kind of god, but with divine approval, glowing omens, and perhaps a really inspiring soundtrack. Historians still argue whether Augustus genuinely believed in Apollo's divine guidance or just found him useful as a brand ambassador. But there's no question the god's image is everywhere. Frescoes show him guiding sun chariots over victorious generals. Poems compare Augustus's rule to Apollo's golden light. Temples are rededicated. Music competitions are held in his honor, partly to entertain, partly to remind people who's sponsoring the culture. It's the birth of the state-sponsored music festival. Fringe theories even suggest that some of Rome's musical notation systems, the little marks that helped standardize rhythm and pitch, were influenced by rituals dedicated to Apollo. Structured music for a structured empire. And the god himself he adapts. He's still radiant, still poetic, but now he glides through marble courtyards instead of sacred groves. He speaks Latin, wears sandals with better ankle support. The Romans don't just worship him, they promote him. You wander through one of his Roman temples now. It's cleaner than the Greek ones, more angular, less mystery, more marble. There's a chorus rehearsing somewhere, their voices sharp and disciplined. No wild improvisations, no satyrs loitering in the wings, just well-trained singers giving polished performances. Apollo nods approvingly from a statue above. He's changed, but he hasn't faded. Because even in Rome, people still want music that feels like sunlight. Still crave that balance of logic and beauty. Still believe that somewhere, high above their civil wars and Senate debates, a god is tuning a lyre and smiling just slightly. And if he happens to look exactly like Augustus, well, brand synergy. You step forward through time again just a little, and suddenly the colors fade, the temples crumble, the marble cracks. Apollo's statues are still standing, but they're chipped now, worn smooth by wind and neglect. His temples are quieter, his songs echo less. Because something new is rising. And it's not particularly musical. Christianity. You're now in the late Roman Empire, and Apollo, once the golden god of everything refined and radiant, is becoming less of a deity and more of a memory. The world is changing, fast and hard, and it doesn't have a lot of patience for sun gods with excellent hair and emotional lyres. You walk through a once grand sanctuary Apollo's. Clearly, but someone's built a small Christian chapel right on top of it. That happened a lot. Old gods didn't get dramatic farewells, they got repurposed. Apollo's name disappears from inscriptions. His festivals get discouraged. His hymns are replaced by psalms. And his music? Well, it gets muted. You hear it in the silence, or the near silence, because there is music in early Christianity chants, plain and spare, no lyres, no poetry competitions, just voices, singing in unison, slow and careful, as if afraid to sound too worldly, too Apollo. Historians still argue whether this shift was a complete rejection of Apollo's influence or simply a deep cultural reshaping. The new faith had different goals. Music wasn't about beauty anymore, it was about humility. Not stirring the soul, but disciplining it. Emotional expression became dangerous. Harmony was holy, but performance distracting. Apollo's greatest trick turning feelings into sound was now a potential spiritual risk. There are fringe writings from this period, anonymous monks, mostly that suggest some of the old gods were still being whispered about. Apollo in particular, not worshipped, not openly, but missed, described as the vanished light or the silent singer. One lonely scroll refers to him as the god who no longer plays, though the strings remain tuned. You pause. Because even though the world has moved on, his music never really stops. It hides. You find it in the shape of a melody carved into the margin of a manuscript, in a stained glass window where the sun hits just right, in the way a church organ holds a note a little longer than necessary. Some believe Apollo morphed into saint-like figures, symbols of healing, music, light. Others think he faded entirely. But the truth is, probably somewhere in between. He didn't die. He dissolved. Into metaphor. Into echo. Into that feeling you get when something beautiful moves through you for no reason at all. You step outside again into a gray dawn. There's no fanfare. Just the wind. And somewhere, faintly so faint, you almost miss it, a note. Maybe it's your imagination. Maybe not. But it sounds like a lyre. Time stretches again, and this time, when it snaps into place, it's no longer marble you're standing on, but cobblestones. There's candle smoke in the air, bells in the distance, robes, wigs, parchment, powdered faces. Welcome to the Renaissance. And guess who's back? That's right, Apollo. He's been out of sight for a few centuries, but not out of mind. And now, as Europe rediscovers all the Greek stuff it once quietly buried under a cathedral, Apollo returns to the stage, not as a god exactly, but as a symbol. A Renaissance remix. You're walking now through a Florentine painter's studio. It smells like oil and dust and genius. On the easel, a glowing, idealized figure in robes of sunrise, holding a lyre, standing atop a chariot pulled by white horses. It's not just a painting. It's an argument beauty matters again. Apollo is no longer suspect. He's in vogue. From Botticelli to Raphael to Caravaggio, artists embrace Apollo as the poster boy for enlightenment. Not the kind that preaches, but the kind that glows logic, clarity, divine proportion. He becomes shorthand for order, knowledge, elegance, even science. Historians still argue whether Renaissance thinkers saw Apollo as a literal being or just a poetic emblem of human potential. But in either case, he fits the mood. This was an age obsessed with light, and who better to carry that torch than the original sun god? You stroll through a salon where intellectuals sip wine and quote Latin. They speak of the Apollonian ideal, not just in music and art, but in architecture, medicine, philosophy. Apollo stands for harmony, clean lines, rationality. He becomes the aesthetic North Star. And not just for high art. You pass a music room where a lute player hums through an early sonnet. The notes are delicate, balanced, unmistakably Apollonian. Lyre music may be out of style, but the feeling is the same, measured, controlled, just emotional enough to feel, but never enough to weep. Meanwhile, composers like Monteverdi, later Bach, begin to talk about divine order in music. Not chaos, not dissonance, harmony as a mirror of the cosmos. Sound familiar? It's Apollo's influence. One fringe story claims a secret society of Renaissance musicians met monthly to write Apollo's hymns in disguise, spiritual pieces tuned to hidden geometries. Whether or not that's true, the idea lingered. That behind every perfect note, every golden ratio, there was a whisper of Apollo. Even fashion gets in on it. The laurel wreath makes a comeback not as sacred, but as stylish. Poets wear it, scholars, even nobles. You pass one such gentleman. Now he looks ridiculous, but pleased. Apollo would approve. But for all the elegance, there's still that bittersweet edge. Because Apollo's not really back. Not as a god, not as a voice. He's an image now, a muse's muse, a brand. Used well, used beautifully, but used. You step into a sunbeam pouring through a cathedral window. It hits the marble just right. Warm, soft, golden. Like an old song you haven't heard in centuries. And though no one speaks his name aloud, you know he's here. Not in temples, but in brushstrokes, and sheet music, and the slow, careful architecture of beauty reborn. The world turns again faster this time. Oil paint fades into photography, lutes into electric guitars, Latin into advertising slogans. You're moving through centuries like pages flipping in a breeze. And still, somehow, he's there. Apollo? But now he's not on pedestals or in temples. He's in ideas, in metaphors, in memes, and somewhere. Wedged between a Spotify playlist and a music theory textbook. The golden god of light and sound is still playing only now. You're not just listening. You're part of the show. Welcome to the modern age. You pass a billboard in downtown Los Angeles. It's for an energy drink, but the figure on it, radiant, athletic, sun-kissed, looks suspiciously Apollonian. You scroll through a film review comparing a movie soundtrack to Apollo's lyre, reimagined by synthesizer. You overhear someone call a classically trained pianist a vessel of the Apollonian ideal. And just like that, the god is back again. In bits? In echoes? In pop culture, Apollo wears 100 new faces. He's the elegant side of music, the clean-cut contrast to the chaos of Dionysus. In Nietzsche's philosophy, he is that contrast, the rational, restrained force opposite wild instinct. In fashion, he's that glowing ideal of form and posture. In movies, He's the quiet, tragic genius at the piano. In comic books, sometimes literally, a glowing, godlike figure with a lyre-shaped weapon and a smirk. Historians still argue whether modern culture consciously channels Apollo or just keeps stumbling into his silhouette. Sunlight, control, music, elegance, power. But the archetype remains because it works. Even AI-generated music gets his touch. Smooth, balanced, algorithmically pleasing. One fringe theory claims that Apollo would be thrilled with artificial composition finally. Music stripped of ego. Another claims he'd hate it, too perfect. No soul, no suffering. You, meanwhile, drift through a record store. Yes, they still exist. On one shelf, a vinyl cover features a man standing in a field of light, arms outstretched, surrounded by subtle rays. No mention of gods. But if you know the old myths, you recognize the pose. Apollo has become a vibe. You lie on a couch now, earbuds in, scrolling past curated playlists titled Sunlight, Peaceful Strings, Modern, Classical for Focus. The sound in your ears, soft, instrumental, shimmering. If you close your eyes, you can almost smell laurel leaves. Almost? Because Apollo's not gone. He's just shifted mediums. No longer a god of temples, but of platforms. No longer invoked, but streamed. You feel him in the balance of tones, in the melodies that loop just right, in the way a single lyric can stop you mid-step because it sounds like something true and timeless. And just for a second, you wonder if he's listening to you now. After all, this music, it plays both ways. The world is quiet now. Not silent, exactly, just quieter, as if it's waiting. The sun has dipped beneath the hills, and all the leftover glow hangs suspended in the air, like a cord held just a little longer than it should be. You're lying beneath a sky that doesn't care about centuries. The stars blink slowly overhead, ancient and indifferent, and the earth hums beneath you with secrets too old for language. And here he comes again. Apollo! Not in a blaze of gold or a triumphant strum of his lyre, but quietly, a shimmer, a feeling in your chest, a warmth that isn't physical. He doesn't need to speak anymore. He's done enough, played enough, inspired enough. Now, he simply lingers. Because the truth is, Apollo didn't accidentally invent the music industry. You did. All of you. Every time a mortal picked up a stringed instrument and tried to say something true, every time a melody healed a bruise you couldn't name, every time someone tuned a note just right, and it echoed a little louder in the chest than it did in the air. Apollo lit the first spark, yes, but it was humans who kept the song going. Through prophecy, poetry, heartbreak, healing, ego, and silence, through temples and taverns and battlefields and wedding halls, through whispered lullabies and symphonic crescendos, and that one perfect line that lives rent-free in your head. You glance down at your own hand. Fingers twitch, as if they remember how to pluck a string. Maybe you don't play an instrument. Maybe you've never sung a note in tune. Doesn't matter. If you've ever felt moved, really moved by music, you're already part of the tradition. One final myth rarely told says that Apollo never left, that he lives not in the sky, but in the pause between notes, the inhale before the downbeat, the space in music where the meaning hides. And tonight, by listening, you've joined his concert. No ticket required. Just breath. And time. And the willingness to feel something as it quietly unfolds. So now, as the last string fades into the hush, you let yourself sink deeper into the calm. There's no need to chase the story anymore. No more gods or riddles or lyres humming in distant temples. Just the softness of breath, the cooling air on your skin, and the warm echo of everything you've just drifted through. Let it blur now. Let the myths fold into dreams, the ancient into the ordinary, and the golden songs of Apollo into the low, steady rhythm of your own resting pulse. You're not in Delphi or Helicon or Rome anymore. You're here. Still. Present. Safe. And maybe, just maybe, with a small piece of ancient music tucked quietly behind your ribs. No need to make sense of it. No need to hold on. Let it float. Let it fade. Let your body grow heavier and your thoughts lighter. You've done enough for one night. The stars are still above you, whether your eyes are open or not. And somewhere in that deep, velvet silence, Apollo's lyre plays one last note just for you. Not to wake you, but to remind you the story is still going, even in sleep. Especially in sleep. So exhale, close your eyes, and drift